This video is going to cover practical assignment 4, which is where we're going to take a scenario where we have some database that we have to create. So this is pretty frequent occurrence for a DBA, right? Is somebody comes along and says, "Hey, we've got all of this data that we need a place to store it, right? We have and a place to work with it and turn it into information, right? Things that can be meaningful to us." And a database is going to support all that. So they might come with you and say, okay, we have all this stuff on spreadsheets, or I've got it maybe in files somewhere, or whatever. We need to develop something that's going to handle this data. We need to somehow convert this and then get it into the database. And also sometimes a developer will come to you and say, here's a database, right? So I developed this database. It's going to work for our application, but all the data is sitting in some other platform right now. And somehow you have to get all this data into the database to get started in order to start using that data. So I want to walk you through a scenario of doing this. So in this practical assignment, we're going to use the scenario of we're going to use some public data and see if we can use that to create a database for ourselves. What I've chosen for this assignment is to use some public data about higher education. There are some 7,000 colleges in the United States that can offer, financial aid, for example. And it turns out that the Department of Education does some pretty extensive surveys every year and gathers information about all of these different colleges that can have financial aid for their students. And of course, a lot of colleges want to provide financial aid because you can get more students that way. So they comply and they provide a lot of detailed information. And it turns out there's a lot of really interesting information in there. And you're going to see this in a few minutes, but you can go on this website and you can find all kinds of public data, which I'll show you. But we're going to use that example, and we're going to try to create a database out of that in MariaDB, and we're going to try to import all of that data. So we're going to go through this whole process, and this whole thought process of what a DBA is going to have to do in order to make a working database out of a bunch of raw data. So that's our plan for this unit. Now, before I get started, I want to show you something. I know in some of my earlier videos, I used Putty to connect to my Linux machine in Google. I also, in my earlier videos, I showed you how to use MySQL Workbench and all that sort of stuff. But this week, we also need to move files back and forth. So I thought about, there's a Putty, there's a version of Putty that includes SCP for moving files. But then I was thinking about it. I'm pretty sure PowerShell has this stuff built in. So I wanted to show you this week PowerShell to do the same thing we were doing with Putty. Now, if you're on a Mac, a lot of you will ask me, Brian, can I do all this stuff on a Mac? So all the commands I'm going to show you in Windows in the PowerShell should also work very similar in a Mac without having to install anything, right? It already has these commands built in. So this should work pretty much the same. So if I'm on a Windows machine, I'm just going to type PowerShell. Well, you do have to spell it right. So I'm going to type PowerShell, and you've got a couple different options. ISE is like a IDE for the PowerShell. There's lots of neat stuff you could do with the PowerShell. Like you can, do all kinds of scripting. In fact, you could do some DBA scripting with the PowerShell. There's lots of cool stuff in the PowerShell for Microsoft SQL Server, for example. And even if you're working with Oracle or MySQL, you can use these tools from PowerShell and do some scripting. And you're going to see that we're going to use some scripting in this unit too. We're going to have to use scripting to import this data because it's going to be a lot of data to work with. But in any event, if I click on PowerShell, right? So I'm just going to click on, I'm going to run it as administrator. All right, so it opens up. There's my PowerShell. Hopefully the font is big enough for you to see it. So the first step is I want to connect to my server, right? So to do that, to connect to my server using SSH to get a command line on my Linux server. Notice I'm not even opening Google Cloud, right? I already know what my IP address is. My server's been running for a couple of weeks, so I have the same IP address. It hasn't changed. But I type SSH, the username on my server, the @ symbol, and then the name of the server. If you have an FQDN or a host name, you could type that instead, but I just have an IP address on mine. I'm sure most of you it's the same thing. So if I do that, if I type SSH and hit the enter key, it's going to ask me for the password. This is the password for my student account on the server, and I'm logged in, right? So now I'm connected to my MariaDB server, right? To my Linux server that's running in Google Cloud. As you saw me do previously, I usually run the su command so that I am running as root. I think I typed the right password. Let's see. Oh, authentication failure. I fat fingered it. There we go. So now I'm connected as root. I can run the ls command, right? It shows me all my stuff. CD to PA4.1, which is what we're going to be working with. I have nothing in there right now. We're starting from scratch. So I'm going to show you kind of this process of how we're going to go and build this database. So let me show you what we're going to be doing. So open up your web browser, and if you just go to data.gov, right, www.data.gov, you're going to land on this website, which is just a treasure trove of all kinds of data. There are hundreds of thousands of data sets right here. There's 241,000 data sets of all kinds of things and all of these different topics. For example, I found a data set of natural gas prices going back to 1950 for every single region in the country. Almost every gas company in the country has been reporting their quarterly, their monthly gas prices per therm to the government for all that time, and you can do all kinds of trending, and you can see, what's happening to gas prices, right? You can do that for lots of different things. Tons of information in here. And as I said, we're going to work with some college data. I think it's the college scorecard, which is what we want. Oops, I hit my. So if I just search for college scorecard, here we go right here. We've got the college scorecard, right? So if I click on that, a couple things I'm going to find in here, right? These are a bunch of different files that I can download. So this is the raw data.zip, right? So that just is it's a zip file with the raw data about, all of these different colleges. So that's really what you're going to want to download, right? So if you click on this, it's a huge file, but you're going to download this. So let me go ahead and click on that. Then I click on download. And it's going to download. It's going to take a little time because it's 254 megabytes, right? So let that finish downloading. So once that finishes downloading, you're going to get a bunch of files in a in a zip file. So you're going to unzip it. You're going to see a whole bunch of stuff. These are basically all the information about all these colleges. So if I open up this, so this one's from 2016-17. It's the last year that they have data in this data set. So if I open that, so let me go ahead and click to open it. So it's a CSV, so of course it opens in Microsoft Excel. You can use another utility if you want, but I find Excel to be easiest to work with these. So we've got all these columns, right? Now, some of these I can figure out, right? Like accrediting, right? This is probably who accredits that particular, there's different accrediting agencies, different regional accreditors in the country. You've got a URL for the institution. We got a name for the institution, the city they're located. Then we got all these other fields. Like, look at all these fields that I have no clue what these even mean, right? We just have these sort of, almost seemingly random labels across the top here, right? So we have to somehow make sense out of all of this. Well, just like with our database design, that there may be something that helps us make sense out of this, right? If we go into, let's see, if we go in here to, oh, I'm sorry, let's go back to the website. So back on the website, let's go back, look at this list of files. So one of these files, hopefully, is going to be a data dictionary. Let's see if we can find a data dictionary. So if I scroll down to references, I've got this data documentation. And if I open that, it says, oh, here we go, data dictionary, right? So I click on data dictionary and it downloads a file. So let's take a look at that file. So I've downloaded the data dictionary. It's an Excel spreadsheet, right? So it's not a CSV. But to work with it, we're going to have to turn it into a CSV to work with it with MySQL. So if I scroll over here, I've got all these different tabs along the bottom, but let's take a look at the data dictionary. And what you'll notice is in the data dictionary, we have a lot more detail, right? So it tells us the name of the data element. So for example, we saw this thing that said, what did it say? It was the value, right? So here we go, the variable name, it says unit ID. So in the other spreadsheet, we had all of these were the headers that you see listed here, right? So all of this stuff was listed. But we had no idea what any of it was, right? We had no idea what type of data. Now look what they did for us here. In the data dictionary, they tell us what the data types are, right? They don't put it in our language for databases, right? So they just put string, but we want maybe variable character. They put integer, for us, that's, maybe going to be a little bit different, or autocomplete doesn't really mean anything to us, right? Um, so we've got all these different data types listed here. We've got all the different variable names, and I can kind of work with this a little bit, right? So one thing I noticed right away is they've got a category, right? So they got this dev category in here. Um, well, if you think about it, there's a lot of columns, right? If we scroll to the left over here, if I scroll this down, there are, let's take a look here, 2,146 columns in this data set, right? So there's a lot of information in here, that we have to kind of sort through this. We got to sort this out a little bit. So this dev category, I don't know specifically what this means, but it looks like they've already grouped this data into, logical groupings. So if I click down here, this little down arrow, oh, I have to enable editing, sorry. So when I enable editing, the nice thing about having this filtering turned on in Excel is if I click this, it shows me all the distinct values. So it looks like these are basically going to be our tables, right? If we split this data up, we could just make one huge table, but I think it makes a little more sense for us to split this up a little bit into different tables. So we can see that right away. We've got all these different tables. Likewise, if I scroll to the right, I can see there's a nice little explanation of what these, what all this is, right? So they give us some notes over here that give us a little bit of information. And there's actually a little bit more information over here, the name of the data element. This gives us a little bit more value, right? So for example, predominant degree awarded, recorded zeros and fours, right? Or schools that are heightened cash monitoring by the Department of Education. Is it or is it not a main campus? How many branches do they have, right? So this makes a lot more sense to me than their variable names, which we have in the file, right? So main, what does that really mean? Well, when I look it up, it means is it or is it not a main campus? But then over here, they tell us that the value of main could be a 0, which means that it's not a main campus, or a 1, which means that it is a main campus. So interestingly, these are going to have to also be tables, right? So each one of these different values is going to have to be a table, and I can sort that, right? So I can come in here and I could say, don't show me the blanks, right? So these are all the variables, or all the columns that have multiple values that are just an integer. So I have to know that in the high deg column, which is, what types of degrees are offered, if I see a 0, it means they don't offer degrees. If I see a 4, it means they have graduate degrees. If it's a 2, they only give associate's degrees, right? So I have to, somehow map this. Now they're only going to have these integers, but we want to be able to show somebody what the actual value of that integer is. Now, one way we could do that is we can insert that into our new table, the actual label, depending on what the integer is. But, that's not normalized, right? We learned how to normalize. These are repeating values. They're going to be in lots of different column or rows, rather. There might be 1,000 rows of associate degree offering colleges. There might be 4,000 that offer bachelor's and another 4,000 with graduate degree. So we want to maintain that structure. So these would likely become their own tables. So we have to figure out some way to do that. So we're going to do that, right? So we're going to give that a try. Now, before we get too deep into this, right? So this is starting to get kind of complicated. Let's take a step back and start kind of simple, right? So I started you out with MySQL Workbench. So now that you have these files, right? So you've downloaded those the college scorecard raw files. You've got the college scorecard data dictionary that you can take a look at. Let's set those aside for a minute. And I'm going to provide in this exercise, let me go ahead and close this browser now that by the way, that's the URL if you're looking for that documentation, right? And I just went to data dictionary. I may also put a copy of these in Blackboard for you. But in case you're watching this video, not at Drexel, you can see where to download this stuff to follow along. So let's close this browser. So if we, let's just, again, we want to keep this kind of simple. I'm going to show you some different techniques here. So I created a table called users, right? User tables. And I've got two tabs. I've got user accounts, right, is one tab. So there's my user accounts. And then I've got some phone numbers over here, right? So every user has a phone number. So I've got a bunch of users, and those users have phone numbers. So if somebody gave me this and I wanted to put this in my database, somehow I need to add, maybe there's something I have to do with this data, right? So I have to start working with this data. Is going to be a part of this larger database project. My first step is I'm going to show you how to do this just using SQL commands, right? So we're going to try this the easy way, right? This is a relatively simple data set to work with. So I'm going to insert a column over here, and let's see, we need some kind of key. I'll call it ID num, right? Really obvious there. Or you know what? We'll keep it simple. We'll just make it an ID, right? And I'll give everybody a unique ID number. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here for phone. There we go. So now I've got an ID number, user ID, and phone, and an email on this table, and over here I've got an ID number. So now I have to save these a CSV. They're a lot easier to work with when it's a CSV with the database engine. So let's go ahead and save these. So I have a folder for all of my PA4 files. There's my user tables.xlsx, but again, we're going to save this as a CSV. So let's see, where is CSV here? There we go, CSV. And actually, I think it's going to be easier if we use tab delineated. So let me scroll down here a little bit. Where is tab delineated? There we go. Text tab delimited. That's what we want. So we're going to use tab delimited, and then we're going to name it by what we want this table to be called. So I'm going to call it API key. This is my API key users, right? Or API users, we'll call it, right? So maybe these are people that are going to have some system that's going to be able to query this big data set that we're importing. Maybe we're creating some kind of web-based application or something like that. So it's API users.txt. All right, that's outputted. Now for the phone number, I'm going to do a little bit different. I'm going to save the phone number. But this one I'm going to do as a CSV because we're going to do this both ways. So this one will be, and we'll call it API user detail. So this one is going to be in a CSV format. And again, I called it API user detail.csv. All right, so now that I've done that, let's go ahead and get rid of this. So I'm going to drag this over. So here are my new files, right? I've got a CSV, and then I've got a text file. So let's open up this text file. We're going to open this with Notepad++. So Notepad++ is a text editor. If you don't have it, I highly recommend giving it a try. And I'm going to use this later in this exercise. We're going to use Notepad++ to do some stuff. But in any event, here's my list. I've got an ID, a user ID, username, user key, and user passphrase. And then I've got all these values in here. We want to import this to our database. So let's set this aside for just a moment and let's log into our database. So I'm over here on my database. So I'm going to log in. Oops. All right, I'm connected. So first, I'm going to type show databases just to see what databases I have. So I've got a test database and my SQL database. I'm going to drop my test database because I don't need it, right? And we saw how to do this earlier, right? There we go. So now if I show my databases, no test anymore. But for my testing, or to create this new database, I'm going to create a database. And I am going to call it College Scorecard. There we go. So now I've got my College Scorecard database, right? It's created. Now I want to create a table in that database, right? But take a look at my prompt. It says that my database is none. I'm not actually connected to a database right now. So I'm going to use, College Scorecard. Oh, I put my caps lock on. And this is actually a good opportunity to tell you that case matters, right? The MariaDB and MySQL are case sensitive, so you have to use the right case. You have to reference objects always with the right case. That includes columns and database names, tables, all of that has to use the correct case. All right, so I'm now in the right database. Again, I can type show tables, right? That's going to show me the tables. I have no tables right now, but I need to create this table that we're going to import to. So we're going to create a table, and I'm going to call it API users, right? Which probably is not a great name for this table because it should be API user, right? Because I talked about how we never use plural, but whatever, I did this wrong, right? So our first column is going to be ID, right? That's from that from the file that I gave you. So we just created that. We added that ID to that table because we need some kind of unique identifier. It is not going to be null. Oops, I almost forgot. It's an integer, right? So it's an integer. It's not null. And I probably want to auto increment it because it is a because it's a key field, right? So that's pretty straightforward. Next, we need to add the user ID. This is going to be a varchar, and I'm just going to make it a max length of 64. I don't know what it would be, but whatever. We'll make it 64. And I'm going to allow it to be null because I really don't care if somebody puts a null value in there. My user's name, again, I'm just going to make it varchar 64. And this is, again, one of those things that it's kind of a judgment call, right, as to how large we're going to make these columns. But remember, this is a dynamic column, so if I use something too large, it's not going to get used anyway. Then the user key, which is kind of like a password, right? But I'm just going to store it as a varchar. And again, 64 should be fine. I'll allow nulls. And finally, I have the user phrase, or no, passphrase, sorry, user passphrase. And you know what, we'll make that a little bit shorter. So we'll make that a varchar 20, right? You can't have a passphrase more than 20 characters. All right, something's got to be the primary key here, right? So my primary key is going to be ID. That's it. So I'm going to close the parenthesis. Engine is going to be InnoDB. And I'm going to have a comment, and it's going to be, this is my user table, right? So we're kind of practicing some of the stuff that we learned in the lecture. Now, hopefully this works. Hopefully I didn't mess up, right? So now if I type show tables, now I've got that API users table. Now I want to import data into that table. I had talked about this this import tool, right? There was this MySQL import tool that's included. It's one of the utilities we have. We don't run it from within MariaDB. We run that outside of MariaDB, right? So we have to exit from this. Now, here's the other problem is in order to get this file, I have to get this file somehow onto the server, right? So the SCP command is a good way to do that. I'm going to open up a different PowerShell window. So this is just a different window, right? So I have one window behind the other. So, and this is on my machine. Maybe I can make this more obvious. All right, I changed mine to black. That way it's obvious that I'm on my machine. So the blue background is going to be on the Linux server. The black background is on my own computer. So on my own computer, first I'm going to I am going to copy that file from my computer up to the server. So to do that, I'm going to use the SCP command. If you want to see what the syntax is, right, it's SCP. There's a couple different options, but you put the source and the target, right? So the file that I have to where I want it to go. So in this case, the file that I have is going to be at C:\\\, and let me get the full path here. So I'm just going to copy and paste it. But I have to do two things here when I copy and paste this. I have to put quotes around it because there's a space in Google Drive. I have all my files on Google Drive. And I also have to put the path to the actual file, right? In this case, it's API users.txt, right? And then the destination, right? The path where I'm going to put it is going to be student at, and I can't remember the. So let's exit this. There we go. So there's the. Trying to go back over here. All right, then I put the colon in, and I'm going to put it into a location on there. It's going to be in PA4.1. So I'm putting it into that PA4.1 folder. Let me show you over here. So if I connect to this again, I've got a bunch of files in here, but there is a PA. So I'm going to type CD to change directory. I'm going to go into PA4.1. There's no files in there right now. By the way, I'm going to change to root just because it's easier, but still in the same directory though, right? If I type pwd, it shows me my current directory, nothing in there. I'm going to go back to my Windows machine. So if I run this command, hopefully this works. It's going to prompt you for the password. Ooh, I get a permission denied, right? So it's not going to let me put that file. So the student user apparently doesn't have permission to that folder. So let me try to set the permissions on this if you don't remember how to do this from your Linux class. So I cd ... to go back up a directory. So now I'm back in my main student directory, and I'm going to, and I'm wondering if maybe it's just not connecting to my home directory. So I'm going to try one thing real quick. If we do, instead of just PA4, we'll do home/student /PA4. Make sure I got that right. Let me drag this back over a little bit. Oops, I did have it right. So student PA4.1. Permission denied still. All right. So if I come back over here, so I changed the permissions to 777. It means give everybody all the permissions to do whatever they want in that folder, right? So I shouldn't get, now of course, if you were a Linux student, you're probably screaming at me right now. You shouldn't do that, but I don't really care because this is just our machine to play on. There we go. Now it worked, right? I set the permissions. Now it copied the file. So if I come back over here, I'm going to change directory back into that PA4.1. I'm going to show the contents. There it is, API users.txt. I'm going to run the MySQL import command. I'm going to move the mouse out of the way here. So MySQL import, we pass in the username, which is root. I'm just going to do -p so it prompts me with the password so everybody doesn't see my password. And then the you have to do --local if the file that you want to import is on your local computer. You have to say local. Now I know I'm on the remote computer, but it's all about context, right? So when this tool runs, it's going to run as the MySQL server, and it's not going to know the relative path to my file, right? But I can just type the file path now, and it's going to be relative. Now here's the interesting thing about this command. What it's going to do is it's going to strip off everything after the dot. So it's going to say, okay, what's the name of this file without any, anything off the end, right? So it's going to get rid of the .txt. So then it's going to say, okay, the name of the file is API users. So that means I must be inserting data to the API users table. The thing about this file is the values in the file must be in the same order as the fields that you're going to import into that table. So that's why I made sure that I had the same fields in both, right? Now, if I did this right, it looks like I didn't do it right. Let's see, -u root, -p, --local. Let me just make sure that's one of the options here. And let me look at the syntax here. So it's MySQL import options, database. Oh, I forgot to put the database name. So we have to tell it what database name. In this case, the database is, You know what? I don't remember the database. So let's go look it up. So we're going to connect with MySQL. It is college scorecard. There we go. So college scorecard. Let's see if this works. Okay, it did something. It says 9 records inserted, deleted 0, skipped 1, 2 warnings. So let's go back into our database. And of course, pause the video if you're trying this, along with me to insert your data. You're gonna be doing the same steps, obviously, right? So you might periodically pause and come back, right? It's a good way to do this. But let me go ahead and log back into my server, and you should be doing the same thing. Okay, so now I'm going to go into my college scorecard. I am going to select star. We didn't learn how to do this yet, but this is going to show me all the records, and hopefully you remember this from a previous class. API users. There we go. So I've got a bunch of users here. So my user IDs are there. I have, and something went kind of wrong here, right? It looks like my user IDs are truncated. If I had to guess, but I'm not sure. Let's take a look here. Yeah, it looks like it truncated it for some reason, but I'm not really too worried about it, right? We're just kind of playing with this. Now what I could do is that first record. So let's delete from API users where ID equals 1. And like I said, it's case sensitive, right? So I deleted that first record. Let's go back and take a look, right? There we go. So I don't know why that first record seemed to be messing it up a little bit, but it did not insert the ID for some reason. I think maybe because it's an auto increment, but that's okay. We don't really even need that, I suppose. What's interesting here, though, is that if we're using InnoDB, so it doesn't really enforce a lot of the rules here, but the ID is a primary key, but they're not unique, right? So it allowed me to insert a bunch of records without a unique key, which is kind of kind of flies in the face of good database management. But again, we're using InnoDB, so that worked. Yours may be a little bit different than this, but as long as you're pretty close to this, I've got my 4 main columns are here. The ID didn't get inserted, but that's okay. But what I want to do is show you another way to do this. So we just did this using the command line. So you connected with SSH into your server. We copied the file with SCP up to the server. We're going to need that again later to move these large files back and forth. So now that I've done this, my next step is to show you how to do this with SQL Workbench, right? So let's open up my SQL Workbench. And I think I told you in that first video that for a lot of things we can use either SQL Yoke or MySQL Workbench. I'm going to use MySQL Workbench because some of you have a Mac and you can't install SQL Yoke. So I want to show you in MySQL Workbench. That way we're all using the same tool. So those of you that have a Mac are going to see the same things. And again, if you're using a Mac, you can also run a lot of these commands that I'm running in the command prompt. They'll work the same way in a Mac. You don't have to use Putty. All right, so let me connect to my MariaDB. And you should do the same thing, right? Pause the video and connect with MySQL Workbench. Okay, so I've got SQL Workbench open, and if I look under schemas down here, I've got my college scorecard schema or my database, and I've even got my table, right? There's my API users table, and I can open that table, right? So I can go here to, I think there's a way to edit this right in here. Select rows, there we go. Yep, and you can actually edit right here if you wanted to, right? Kind of neat that you can do this. And actually, it looks like my IDs are here, right? It actually inserted the IDs for us. So I don't know why it didn't show it in the MySQL tool, but whatever. So in any event, now I want to import those records, but I'm going to do it a different way here. I'm going to right click on college scorecard, and I'm going to go to data or table data import wizard. And then I'm going to, and you can see here it supports CSV, JSON data files. Luckily, we have a CSV. So I'm going to go to user detail, right? This is just, where is mine? It should be a CSV. I thought I saved it. Let me just double check here for you. Oops, there we go. Yep, API users detail. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. I don't know why I didn't see that. All right, so there's my table. I'm going to open that. Click next. All right, so we're going to create a new table, college scorecard dot API users detail, right? This lets us change it, unlike the other tool. We could drop the table if it already existed, right? Kind of handy. This lets us see the values that we're going to be inserting, right? And we can change the data types if we want. So I can come down here and make this a varchar if I want to, but I'm just going to leave these as text. That's perfectly fine. If you recall, it's very similar to varchar, right? This is just going to be a varchar with a maximum length of 216, essentially. But in any event, I'm going to hit next. Oh, by the way, before I do that, you can see the encoding here. It automatically selected UTF-8. I think it probably detected that. And somehow MySQL Workbench is a little buggy sometimes. There we go. I lost my next button down there. So I just resized the window to get it back. So now when I hit next, it's going to tell me what it's doing in the process. So let's see what happens. It prepared the import. It's importing the data file, and it's done, right? I hit finish, and I come back over here. I'm going to refresh this, and there's my two tables. And if I open these up, right, there's my my columns, and I can open them up if I wanted to, right? So I could come over here and I could right click and I could select the top 1000 rows, which I did already, right? And I can see my stuff in here. So now I've just imported two tables. I've done it two ways. I've done it with the command line, and I've also done it with MySQL Workbench. And you can decide which one is easier or which one is better, right? We have both options, right? So if you don't have Workbench, you can still do this if you needed to. What I'd like you to turn in at this step, if you're going to take a screenshot of MySQL Workbench showing the API users detail, but then I'd also like you to go into your machine and just show me the select statement in here from API users, right? So show me a select showing me the values and API users from here as well. And once you finish that, then come back to the video and we're going to move on to the next step. So for the next step, if you have Windows, it might be a good idea to install Notepad++. It'll make the next step a little bit easier. And if you come over here, so in mine, I installed a plugin called NPP-FTP, and it lets me connect to a server using FTP. So I went in here to my settings, I went to profile, and I was able to set up my connection. Now, if you can't do this, if you have a Windows or a Mac and you don't have the ability to install this, there's other options on a Mac that does exactly the same thing. There's just something slightly more advanced than your basic text editor. Most of them have plugins that can do this sort of thing and show you a tree on an SFTP server on a remote server. But if you can't do this, you can always just use, as you saw me do here, you can use the SCP utility, which again works on both Mac and Windows. They both have SCP, to copy these files from your machine up to the server to try this stuff. It'll just be a little faster if you do it this way, just because you don't have to keep going back and forth with different utilities. So if I connect this, you can see I'm in my home directory here, and I open this up. There's that text file that we copied earlier, right? And if I double click on it, it shows me the contents of that file. So I'm going to create a new file here. And before I do this, let me explain what we're going to do. So one of the things about working with data sets is those tools that I showed you in the previous section were pretty rudimentary, right? You can import data, but that database table that I have that we downloaded, that scorecard for colleges, is too big for us to use that utility. There's way too many columns. There's too many records. We have to do a little bit of work to try to narrow this down to what we need in our database. And we have to do a little bit of analysis to figure that out. And I'm going to walk you through this process. We're going to do this together. But in many cases, the DBA has to use some scripting language to try to process this large amount of data, right? You could sit there and do it by hand, but it take you, weeks to do that with a huge data set, especially the one that we're working with here. So we have to use something else to process this stuff and work with this data. There are a lot of different scripting engines that can work with text files and that can interact with the database. You could use shell scripting in Linux. You could use the PowerShell in Windows. You can use Python or Perl. You probably learned Python or Perl or something like that in your college classes, or JavaScript or VB.net or C++. I mean, all of this stuff can do, again, it's just whatever tool you're most comfortable with. Now, for this class, I think the easiest one to use, because it's really easy to install it on your machine, is just to use PHP. PHP has the ability to work with MySQL natively. You don't have to install any drivers for anything like that. It just works. And PHP is pretty powerful for processing text files. It's got a lot. I mean, normally we use PHP for web programming, right? But we can also use it as a scripting language. We can also use it, on the console in Linux. So I'm going to create a file called db, I don't know, dbscript.php, right? So here's my database script, and it's going to create it in my pa4.1 folder. Here it is right here. So I've got that script, right? If I double click on this, it's going to open it up, and I could start writing some code in here. Now, the problem is, in order to do this, we have to make sure PHP is installed on our machines. So to do that, we're going to go into our machines. I am going to exit from MySQL. So from the command prompt here, I am going to install PHP by typing yum php install. And it's going to tell me no such command. So let's see. It's, is it apt? And we're on, we're on Red Hat, right? So we should be able to run yum install. Sorry, I think I have it backwards. Yum install PHP. At least this isn't a Linux class. All right, so we run yum install PHP, and you can see that mine is already installed. I'm already at the latest version. I'm on PHP 5.4. You'll probably have the same one if you run this utility. You're also going to want to install php-mysql, and that'll allow you to use MySQL from PHP. So again, I already have that as well. I think you can just run both at the same time. So if you do install PHP space PHP MySQL, it'll just check both, right? So it just tells you that both are already installed. If yours are not already installed, you're just going to hit Y for yes, because you want to install it, and let it install. And when you're done, you're going to come back. So if you haven't done that yet, make sure you pause the video and then come back. But if you have done it, this is how we're going to test it. We're going to come over here. So we're going to create a little script in PHP. So I'm just going to type PHP, and then I'm going to close it like this. And I am going to, I think we should be able to run PHP info. I think this is a standard function. Oh crap, I don't know what I did there. All right, sorry, I hit a weird shortcut key and it collapsed my menu. But you just, so just type exactly what I typed here, right? In the same way. I'm just going to make this a little bigger so you can see it. Just PHP info, right? So I put my opening PHP tag in, just like I'm doing web development, but we're not. Again, we're going to use this as a console application. So PHP info should just test to tell us whether or not our PHP installation is working. So if I come back over here, I'm just going to type, what is it, db_script. .php, and I have to put the PHP command first, right? So it's going to be PHP and then db_script. It's going to run and apparently do absolutely nothing. I think maybe we have to echo that. So let's take a look. It's been a while since I've done this. So I save that. By the way, because I'm connecting with Notepad++, every time I save this file, it automatically pushes the latest version up to the server. If you're not using this, you're going to have to use the SCP command. So you have to come back over here and run this SCP command to copy it from your computer to the server each time you make a change to that file before you can test it. And again, I would use two PowerShell windows, one that you're working with in your own computer to SCP stuff back and forth, and the other one just connected with SSH. That way you're not constantly connecting and reconnecting and so forth. So let's see if that works. There we go. So that worked. That output a whole bunch of stuff. That just tells me that PHP is working. So beyond that, I'm really not too concerned about it. So now that we know that we have PHP working, right, I'm just going to leave this here in place. And now we're going to switch gears. We're going to go back to those Excel spreadsheets, and we're going to start working with those Excel spreadsheets and start copying them up to our server. So I'm going to go ahead and close my user detail spreadsheet. We don't need that anymore. And back over to this spreadsheet. This is the data dictionary. Our first order of business here is we have to create our schema first. And it just so happens that everything we need to create our schema is already here, right? We know that the dev category is going to be our table name, right? So that's going to be our table name. The name of the data element is going to be that's just going to be, a description, right? We can use the comments for that. We talked about comments and column names. Well, that's a good place to get our comments from, right? We can just use that. And then we have our developer-friendly name for all these fields. We have the variable name, which is going to probably be, I think variable name probably makes the most sense for our column names. We have our data types, which are integer, right? So if we click this little button here, it looks like, well, that's not right. Let's see. Oh, I have a filter down here. So let's turn off this filter, right? So for our data types, it looks like we've got autocomplete, float, integer, and string, and then some that are blank, right? So we care most about autocomplete, float, integer, and string, right? Those, and we're going to figure out what makes the most sense in our database. The variable names, right? We have a whole bunch of variable names. These are all going to be distinct. And then we have a label, which might be interesting, right? The label, but really, what it looks like is the label is going to be, so for example, for main, we have two possible values, main campus and not main campus. For degree type, right, we have four possible or five different values. For higher education degree, we have four possible values. For control, right, is it a public institution, private for-profit, or private nonprofit? What state are they in, right? There's a whole bunch of these different ones, right? What locale? Is it a city? Is it small? Is it in a suburb? What's the I don't even know what this is. It looks like different types of degrees. Um, all kinds of stuff in here, right? Oh, look at this one. This is the religious affiliation. So you could even, you know, you can even identify which colleges are affiliated with different religions, right? Or if they even are affiliated with a religion, for example. So lots of interesting things in here, but we are going to, we're going to try to make these all these tables. So the first thing from my perspective, the first thing I think we want to do is create these tables that have these values. Now, that said, if you recall from the lecture, there were enum and set data types. That some of these would probably be really good for enum or set. They would make a lot more sense semantically to use enum or set. But I want to keep this relatively simple, so we're just going to use a different table and just normalize these to different tables. So what I need to do is make myself a new Excel spreadsheet that only shows these tables, right? That shows these variable names and what their possible values are, as well as any additional notes that that I might want to use on these. So let's see how we can do that. So my first step is I am going to show, it looks like all the ones that I want are going to have a label. So first, let's not show anything that's blank for the label. All right, so I'm going to clear that filter. So that filter, so now I'm only showing things that have enumerated labels. So this makes sense. Now let's scroll down a little bit here. So is there anything here that I don't want? And it looks like the only thing that I'm not going to want is these down here, all these PCIP, whatever they are. Like these I don't think we're really going to need. So the other thing I want to do, let's see if we can filter those out. So I think what's going to make the most sense here, I was just kind of thinking about this, is let's just manually get rid of these that we don't really need. Actually, you know what? It looks like this value field might be a way to do this, right? If that's a blank value, let's scroll this down. Aha, so if we take out the blank values, that gets us just what we want, right? So now I have a column for the label, I have a value, right? And I've got these other fields too, but not really too concerned about those. So now I just want to make a CSV that has only these values. I don't care about anything else. I just want a CSV that has just these values. We're going to work with that to make our other tables, right? So these are going to be the tables that get referenced by our main tables, right? They're going to be foreign keys to these little tables that have these extra values for us. So let's go ahead and do that. And I think the easiest way to do that um, in Excel, I think what we're going to have to do is you have to copy this data, right? Which seems kind of silly, but I'm sure there's another way to do this, but I'm just going to copy this, right? So I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to create a new Excel spreadsheet. There we go, right? And that's only the data that I want, right? There's nothing extra here that I don't need. And I'm going to add a new column over here. I'm just going to call it ID. And I'm just going to do this so that I have, I don't even care what's in ID. I just want something over here because sometimes it's a little bit easier to work with this data when you have have an extra column in the front. Okay, so now this is my other data, right? This is going to be my other tables. It's going to be so now let's think about this. What do we want here? So these are going to be the column names, right? So main is going to be a column name in some other table. Pred is going to be a column name. It's going to reference this other table. So what do I call this table that contains these values? Well, I think the easiest thing to do just in this first pass is let's just use these names, but just use lowercase, right? Because all of our other tables are going to be lowercase, right? Because we're going to use these as our table names. So let's just make these lowercase. And we could just, again, we can use PHP to convert it to lowercase. That's pretty easy. So we're going to identify our table names, and then we have to identify all the values that are associated with those table names. Now, in order for this to work, I got to have these table names, right? They have to be applied to each one of these. So we are going to do this, right? So I'm going to make sure that they all have an associated record. And we have our locale 2 apparently. It's a little bit tedious, but we'll get there. We're almost done. And I think these guys are all different values, so we can get rid of these. Right, so these three I'm going to get rid of. Right, I only want ones that have multiple values. If it's a single value, it doesn't really matter. Then it's just another column. Okay, there we go. So we've got these all filled in. So now we know which table. So what I've done here is now these are going to be two columns, right? So this is going to be a column. This is going to be a column. So there's going to be a column that contains the label, a column for the value, both in the main table. And there's going to be another table called HIDEG, which is going to have all these possible values, right? And so forth and so on. Oh yeah, these are two different groups, right? So this is one group, this is another group. They kind of look the same, right? Control and then state, right? So these are each going to be a table, and that's basically how we're going to have to process this. So this we have to save as a CSV. So I'm going to save this as, and I'm going to what should we call this? I'm going to call this scorecard. Well, first of all, it's a CSV. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. CSV. And we're going to call it college scorecard, other tables, right? So we're going to make these other tables first. And I'm going to save that. Okay, so I've got the table now, right? I've got this set up. We're going to do something similar. So we're going to take the same data dictionary. We're going to do some similar processing on it to do some other stuff later, but let's start with these other tables first. Now I'm 55 minutes into the video, so I'm going to stop the video, and so there'll be another YouTube video that's going to continue through this. So I'll stop it. There'll be a second video, and there'll probably be a couple other videos too. I'm going to break them up into smaller pieces, but I don't want to make these videos too long because then I can't save them. So I'm going to stop here, and then we'll write the script together that's going to create these tables. We're just going to make a little script. And again, you could use Python or Perl. We could use anything, but we just want to get this logic into a script. You can use my script, or you can come up with your own if you think you could do one that's better, but at least we'll walk through the logic together.